I'm Emily Lawrence. I'm the Aspen Strategy Group Fellow with the team, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. We're delighted to have Kurt Campbell here with us tonight, Aspen Strategy Group member, chairman and co-founder of the Asia Group, and former Deputy Secretary of State, as well as Edward Luce, U.S. National Editor and Columnist at the Financial Times, to discuss Ed's new book, Zbig, The Life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Great Power Prophet. Copies of the book are available for sale at the Politics and Prose booth in the back. So please grab your copy. Ed will be signing books afterwards. We'll also have time for Q&A from the audience at the end. So get your questions ready. And with that, I will turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, folks. I'm Kurt Campbell, and I forgot the thing. I'm Kurt Campbell, and it's just such an honor to be asked to do this. And I just want to first just alert all of you, this is a sensational book. I found reading it, it took me through many chapters of my own life, my own interactions with Zbig. What Ed has managed to do is not only basically present a kind of a three-dimensional case study of a key strategic player during this period of American foreign policy, but also capture a number of critical sort of environments in which he lived. Washington of the 1970s and 1980s, Cambridge during the sort of intense period of academic rivalry, New York and Columbia, growing up in Canada, his experience as a kid, just distant memories in Poland. So it's sensational, and it captures, and as you read it, you'll be struck. It feels like a period, not just in the immediate history, but almost the distant history. So remember, the most important thing at a book launch is to buy a book. And so that is what we're all going to do. And then Ed will I've instructed him to sign quickly, move on, don't get a cramp in his hand. So we're thrilled that all of you have turned out for what I think is going to be one of the most important books around foreign policy, contemporary politics, really of this or any other year. So I want to get you started, Ed. So, I've followed you closely over the years. I'm just curious, of all the things that you could write about, what inspired you to decide to write really what is the first thoroughgoing biography of Zbig Brzezinski?
Well, first of all, thank you to Aspen and to everybody for coming. Second of all, I should say that, if you have a guardian angel for a book launch, and Kurt Campbell decides he likes it and wants to help, your guardian angel has more than fulfilled, because this guy's extraordinary energy and judgment and force of character is hard to match in this town. So thank you, Kurt, as well, for your very kind words about the book. Why did I write it? These are the sort of the two sort of great rivals, frenemies of the Cold War, Brzezinski and Kissinger. Kissinger was a celebrity, and almost nobody, at least in the modern era, becomes a celebrity in this business. I mean, I guess Dick Holbrooke was kind of celebrity-ish, but only in this town. Kissinger was a worldwide celebrity, and has had countless biographies, and he's had, he wrote 4,000 pages of autobiography as well, and I did talk to him a lot for this book, but before he died, obviously. I didn't contact him after he died. And he asked me in the first interview why I was doing this, and I said, there hasn't really been a full biography. There has been a really good intellectual biography and a life biography by Justin Weiss, which is translated into English. There's been a really good Festschrift of sort of essays by Charles Gatti of SAIS, but there hasn't been a full life biography, and so that's a massive gap in the market. His autobiography, which was very badly reviewed, Power and Principle, was not 4,000 pages or 3 volumes. It was quite short, relatively speaking. And the family, Mark Brzezinski, initially the middle offspring of the 3, came to me with the diaries that Zbig kept. He dictated them into a dictaphone in the car on the way back to Spring Hill, McLean, every night. So about half an hour of dictation. And these are just gripping. They're very, very thick. There's a lot of words in there. But they're just gripping first draft of history. And so once I started reading them, and then got access to tons of other material without strings attached. This is a non-authorized biography.
And folks, this is important, although he's every morning, he's on Morning Joe this week, which is a wonderful thing. I think it has been embraced by the family. But in one of the sessions yesterday, Micah said, look, this has been important for me. It's been painful at times because there were parts of the book that either she did not know or, was like reliving, but it's important that this is a book that is really independent. It's not been weighed in upon. This is Ed's best judgment.
Yeah, and they read The Galley at the same time as everybody else. And I don't know whether Ian Brzezinski is here, but he was there. We had a book party last night. And, I felt really self-conscious talking about his dad in front of him. You are really, the role of a biographer is very intrusive. You come to it initially with the fascination of the Sovietology, the big Cold War grand strategic issues, the post-Cold War role, the fact that there isn't a really sort of mainstream English language biography, but you find yourself rifling through proverbial underwear drawers, quite without expecting to. The private life, the love letters, the secret diaries, everything's relevant. And so when Mika said she found it painful at times to read, there were some revelations there for the family.
Yeah, thanks on that. So that first question flows naturally into the second. And this, I think, gets into the complexity of his life and how he was viewed. Why do you think it's taken so long for him to get this kind of due? You talked a little bit about the relationship between Kissinger and Brzezinski. One of the wonderful things about this book, it lays bare this extremely complicated relationship, this dance the two played that began in a graduate seminar at Harvard and that culminated on Brzezinski's last trip to Europe for the Nobel Award, which he thought he was going to get by himself, and of course was at the end paired with Kissinger. And I think he sort of came to recognize that almost was his fate. But what's also interesting is a series of fascinating relationships with individual people. It's not just Brzezinski, it's not just Kissinger, it's his relationship with Vance, it's his relationship with Carter, it's his relationship with Harriman. Every one of his relationships were deeply complicated and had Okay, so tell us, what is your theory why that there hasn't been as much focus and attention on what is arguably one of the most important strategic thinkers of the 20th century?
I think Kissinger was just a sort of Olympic level seducer of people. He was really, really good at winning people over. He was very obviously attentive to what we would now call his brand, to his image. And he would flatter journalists, which, being a journalist, everybody loves being flattered.
It's an excellent point.
It's working. Thank you for complimenting me, Kurt. He would flatter journalists, and he would seduce, his interlocutors. He wasn't brilliant with people who worked for him all the time, some of whom he tapped, against their, without their knowledge. But he was a very, very good impresario in public, and his press conferences were just sort of these virtuoso performances, kind of Olympian. And Brzezinski did not tolerate fools. And I think if he thought somebody was a fool, he would verbally decapitate them. And he would do the opposite of flatter and seduce. And so he made a lot of enemies in the media and in this town more generally. And I think was therefore didn't have the audience that was prepared to give him his due. I think history, as it goes on, and these sort of the raw little personality things that were a constant of Brzezinski's life. He was a difficult character. There's no doubt about it. I think that history will treat him a lot more objectively as time goes on, because I make the contention. It's not an argumentative book, it's a biography, but in the research I did, that he did have more of an impact, I think, on the Cold War and on the peaceful resolution of it than Kissinger. I do think history will probably agree with that conclusion.
For me, the part of the book that I found most compelling and interesting was this heady period where a group of very strong scholars are all maneuvering for position among either Democratic or Republican candidates for president in the early 1960s and into the 1970s. When I read that, I had always thought, when I read, and I knew Brzezinski well, I always thought that he had a very clear view of the Soviet Union and had sort of principles that would not waver. He believed that the institution of Soviet power was essentially weak, and that much of what we saw as adventurism were examples of that weakness as opposed to strength. And I had always sort of believed that that was a constant running through his work and his public address. But what you make clear in this book is that his views often evolved and maneuvered depending on the political circumstances, and you realize how very ambitious he was, and he was prepared where necessary to trim his scales. Talk a little bit about that element of his sort of approach to public policy and public life.
Yeah, he had sharp elbows. I mean, one of the really interesting features of this book is when he's rising as a Sovietologist initially at Harvard, then at Columbia, he was denied tenureship at Harvard and moves to...
I thought that would have hurt him more than you depict in his book. He seems to sort of take it in stride in the book, and just moves on to Columbia. I thought it would be devastating for him.
It wasn't. So what the legend of Kissinger and Brzezinski is that Kissinger there was one post and he got it.
That's not right.
That's not correct. And they weren't really rivals then. This was 1959. But he clearly was hurt, but he sort of brazened it out. He then did get offered tenureship at Harvard 3 times and said, no, screw you, I want to be nearer Washington. New York was nearer Washington. It was next to the Council on Foreign Relations. He was writing for Foreign Affairs. He was mailing every Foreign Affairs piece he did and other pieces to every faculty in the country, but more importantly, every newspaper editor, every senator. So his ambition, his drive, his focus was pretty extraordinary. And of course, he had a Rockefeller too. It's not just that Nelson Rockefeller was the patron of Henry Kissinger, it's that David Rockefeller became, you had to have a Rockefeller if you weren't part of the WASP sort of gilded elite. And that, to me, is a really fascinating sort of aspect on this, in which I feel, I've got some insight, because these WASP elites were, you would call them English Americans, but for the origin of America's story. But they saw him as an inherently biased Polish American, and therefore just not capable of expressing what Robert Lovett, one of the wise men, called the true American ethos. He might get us into a war with Russia. Such is the Polish loathing. And Dean Acheson, Averell Harriman, Chip Bolan, people like that, the other wise men, they did have this, essentially this supposition about Brzezinski that really blocked him at many points.
Yeah, you see this when Carter is trying to make his decision about his team when he's elected, and Ed depicts the story of Brzezinski's role in the formulation and foundation of the Trilateral Commission and how he maneuvers in that. And Carter is sort of the not well-known governor, but is courted and sort of brought along, educated about foreign policy more directly. But when Carter is sort of looking around for who, I think the book makes clear he decided very early on that Brzezinski would be the national security advisor. But it is remarkable how many people counseled Carter against him. Dozens of people, and almost the entire senior foreign policy elite of the United States at that time. There were worries that he wouldn't work with Vance very well. There were worries about how he behaved interpersonally. But maybe say a little bit about the other allegation. It was not just that he would be so biased against the Soviet Union and détente and the like, Ed, but the worry that he was anti-Semitic.
Yeah, can I just mention one, before I get onto that question, one thing about Carter and his relationship. Carter, in a way, was picked by Brzezinski because they needed somebody for the Trilateral Commission, one Democratic governor, one Republican governor. And here was a New South, pro-civil rights Democratic governor from Georgia. And Carter uses the Trilateral Commission, set up by Brzezinski and David Rockefeller, to give himself this crash course in foreign policy to prepare for his, this is 1972, to prepare for his 1976 run. And he kept saying, this is a repeated line, "I am an eager student of Zbig." And Brzezinski 2 or 3 times said, look, Governor Carter, the Americans don't want to elect a student. They want to elect a leader, so please just sort of downplay that. But the anti-Semitism thing, sort of that whisper, and then in some cases overt allegation, it started arising pretty much straight away after the Carter administration began. Morris Amatai, the head of AIPAC, really loathed Brzezinski, and it was mutual. And when Rabin was defeated and Menachem Begin, this liquid, this change, whole sea change in Israeli politics, comes in, there is obviously a pushback against Carter's desire for a de facto two-state solution. He called it a Palestinian homeland, but it was a de facto two-state solution. And as you know better than anybody in this room, when you want to attack a president, you don't attack a president, you attack an advisor, because you want to keep some lines open to the president. And Brzezinski was blunt. He was not diplomatic in how he spoke about Israel. And of course, he still had a Polish accent. And Poland's history is not good when it comes to pogroms. And so he was a pretty soft target. What Begin did when he first got here was an extraordinary Menschy thing to do.
It is actually quite remarkable. Why don't you describe how he handed him those papers and how Brzezinski responded?
Remarkable. So Brzezinski's father, Tadeusz Brzezinski, was a Polish diplomat, including in Leipzig, Germany, during the early Nazi years. And he issued tons of passports and laissez-passes to German Jews of Polish origin against the wishes of his government back in Warsaw, which recalled him at the Nazi government's request. And Begin invited the cameras, the photographers, to Blair House, where he was staying, and handed to Brzezinski this testimony to his father's help for the Jews in their darkest hour, and said, the Jewish people, Mr. Brzezinski, addressing Zbig's father, never forget a friend. And this was he threw him a real solid. And so I think it's perhaps less understood that Carter wanted this deal, and Brzezinski was an able lieutenant, as was Cy Vance, and it culminated in Camp David. But Carter could not stand Begin, just couldn't be in the same room with him. Loved Sadat, Egypt's leader, but couldn't stand Begin. Brzezinski spoke Polish with Begin. And so Brzezinski was the Begin whisperer. And this was a rare issue where Vance, Carter, and Brzezinski are all rowing in the same direction, but Brzezinski's the Begin man, and Begin is the obstacle to a deal. The rest of the Israeli team really want a deal. And on the Egyptian side, it's the other way around. The entire Egyptian side do not want to recognize Israel. Sadat, though, very romantically wants to sort of change the weather. And of course, it led to his death. But that's, I think, sorry, just in conclusion, I don't think, in fact, I know, I'm pretty sure, you can't prove these things, that although he was a strong critic of Israel, Brzezinski was never an anti-Zionist. he was just tactless. That doesn't mean anti-Semitic. I don't think he was an anti-Semite.
I want to ask a couple more questions and then open it up to the audience if I can. We've talked about these animating personal relationships. The most interesting and important one is the one between Brzezinski and Kissinger, which basically runs their entire adult life. And what's fascinating about it is that there are periods where they go to dinner at a restaurant that's long since been closed, and they want to be, or I guess it was lunch, they want to be seen together. You could tell that Kissinger was using some of his charms on Brzezinski. It feels a little bit from the book that the first salvos in the competition with the elbows flying actually come from Brzezinski. Kissinger's a bit surprised by that, but then once the battle is joined, every year they're kind of back and forth at each other. Help the audience understand a little bit of the complexity of this incredible relationship that really, in many respects, defines the contours of the Cold War.
It really does, and it's not just that they were frenemies and rivals, and who could be cutting each other's career throats or trying to, and then dining together at Sans Souci, as you say, since closed. It's that their intersection, and this is sort of very cinematic. I have used that word a few times. Their intersection occurs first in 1938. Brzezinski, age 10, crossing the Atlantic. His father gets posted, so he's not a refugee, but gets posted as consul general to Montreal. His dad knew exactly what was coming, and that was a week or two after Munich, after the infamous Chamberlain-Hitler summit. A 15-year-old Heinz Kissinger crosses the Atlantic 2 or 3 weeks before Munich. So they have that intersection then, and as you mentioned earlier, their last meeting was December 2016, a few months before Brzezinski died in Oslo, on stage in Oslo. And in between, I mean, it's an extraordinary relationship to just look at the letters and the correspondence over that many years and how it evolves from sort of mutual respect but slight distance at Harvard. Kissinger was a diplomatic historian. He was not a Sovietologist. And obviously Brzezinski was a Sovietologist. It goes from that into the moment Nixon is elected, and Nixon then a few days later says to Kissinger at the Pierre Hotel in New York, I want you to be my national security advisor, but not just national security advisor. You're going to lord it over the Secretary of State. Brzezinski that day went and bought a notebook. That day, his ambition started soaring. He thought, somebody with a foreign name and a foreign accent can get that far. And so that's when the real rivalry began.
In that notebook, he writes the people when he's going to be national security advisor that he's going to bring into government. And about half of the people on that note list, he actually ultimately brings with him to the NSC.
One of them, like 2 or 3 of them are here. Robert Hunter is here, who served for 4 years in, I don't know where Robert's sitting, but served for 4 years in the, all 4 years for Zbig. But yeah, he had, and the list of names were the list that he hired.
And we might ask Robert in a moment if he wants to ask a question or jump in. We are going to open it up in a minute. I do want to ask just a few other things as you go on. So the only thing that surprised me about the book, you have remarkable insights to early and other parts of his life. I had no idea he spent so much time, out gallivanting, a huge amount of time. He either was writing, playing tennis, or out on dates, as far as I can tell. But what is striking about all that you reveal, it doesn't appear to me that he had very much of an internal life. There's very little about other than just raw ambition and just striving. You don't get a sense of reflection or big questions that he's grappling with. So, and I will say I found that absent in the book. How would you respond to that, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, it's absent in the book because I think he was a very external-facing person. I mean, self-reflection was not his strong suit. And I mean, I know his family who adore him, but did sort of see that side of him. He was very, very tunnel visioned and absolutely determined. Loved to have fights. Did not sort of approach his opponent in a wily way. He went straight for their jugular. And often won, and sometimes didn't. He used to play tennis a lot on the White House court, which they called the Supreme Court. He would, the way they described it was he would either hit a winner or he would hit the ball and it would just go out of sight and nowhere near the court. And chess he used to play a lot. And the criticism of him was he'd bring the queen out too early. And he had that famous game with Begin in Camp David, where Begin bullshits him basically. It's like, the last time I played, it was in 1940, and the game got interrupted by the NKVD, the Soviets, who arrested me. And in the middle of the game, it was 2-2. There's Ian Brzezinski. In the middle of the game, Mrs. Begin comes out and says, Menachem, he's always playing chess. I love stories like that. Yeah. But yeah, he was, and I'm now going to start to censor myself because Ian has just walked in. But he was, fair to say, not the most inwardly reflective or sort of pondering or self-questioning character.
I will say I once, he had quite a relationship with Sam Huntington, as you describe in the book. And there was a period when Sam was a professor at Harvard. He would bring young academics out to camp, to sort of near Woods Hole for a set of weekends, and they're all same level of ambition as Zbig. And Zbig would come out for the day, and there would be huge discussion about who would play tennis. I'd played a bit of tennis in my life, and so I was asked, and I remember Sam saying, please, you've got to set him up so he could have a good volley and everything like that. So quite a lot of focus on a good tennis match. So if you had to just, and we're going to open it up now, sort of summarize his biggest contributions, both intellectually and in the practitioner barrel of what he did as National Security Advisor. Give us those two contributions from your perspective.
So a very particular one, which is what didn't happen, which is the Soviet invasion of Poland. And you don't get rewarded or thanked by history for what didn't happen, but it was absolutely imminent. There were 18 Soviet divisions, 15 Soviet, two East German. I mean, think of that. Germany wanted to invade Poland in 1980, along with Russia again, and one Czech. And they were on the verge. They had the best, I think, Cold War asset they ever had, Colonel Kuklinski, who the CIA called Jack Strong, who was the Polish liaison to the Soviet general staff, the Polish general staff, and he was just feeding them everything, all the plans. They were there, they were setting up hospitals, they closed all the borders. Brzezinski's relationship with Pope John Paul II, who happened to be Polish, first non-Italian in 450 years, real serendipity, helped persuade, and the fact that Brzezinski was a scholar of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 to quash the Prague Spring, and then in Hungary, 1956. He knew what the Americans had signaled wrongly. He also knew that Poland, unlike Czechoslovakia and Hungary, it had a church, a trade union movement, and an intellectual movement that were all singing the same hymn. And it was very hard for the Soviets to understand a working class trade union movement that was not only anti-communist, but which had the Pope on their walls. It just didn't fit in with the Marxian prism. So he used all this, he and the Pope in tandem, and their correspondence, which I got translated, is fascinating, to persuade the Soviets that Poland was indigestible, that it was a porcupine, and that invasion didn't happen. More generally, though, I think he saw, and I think probably with a lot of truth to it, the Soviet Union as a Russian empire in Marxist clothing. And he saw its Achilles heel as being the suppressed nations, not just of the Warsaw Pact and of his native Poland and the others, but of the nations within, the Ukrainians, the Georgians, the Kazakhs, the Belarusians, etc. and that this Achilles heel was the key to the unraveling of the Soviet Empire. And that unraveling did begin then with the Solidarity movement.
It is interesting. He gets very little credit for it. There are periods during the Cold War when Kissinger's in power. In truth, Kissinger was very pessimistic about the United States, felt that we were in decline, and that his job was to cut the best deal possible with the Soviets. That was actually much of his animating view in arms control and the like. Brzezinski, who had relations with people like Elmo Zumwalt, who was in a discussion with Kissinger in which he inadvertently revealed, look, they're Sparta, we're Athens, we got to cut our best deal because they're coming for us. That really bothered Brzezinski. He was a deep believer in the power, the innovative might of the United States. He's one of the first people to really understand the power of technology. And so much of that period in which the view was that the Soviets were ascendant, he never believed that and always believed, and he was in a very significant minority, but it is remarkable how prescient some of his analysis about what ultimately happened in the Soviet and how it played out over time. Just last thing, and then we'll open it up. Tell me a little bit about, so much of the book is about some of this bitter infighting with Vance and also, the maneuvering and competition with Kissinger. Tell us how he left it with both men from your perspective, right? Like, it appears to me, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Kissinger really worked you to try to make clear how much respect he had for Brzezinski. He wanted it to end on a better note, wanted softer edges for the book. What was your thinking? But Vance, very different.
Kissinger was helpful, and I think I did two proper long interviews with him, and there was some other interactions. But the first one, he made this. I didn't know whether he was joking or not, because he said it was tragic how young Zbig was. And I said he was 89, and he goes, he sort of laughs. His whole point was, that he's a very good sense of humor, Kissinger, and his whole point was he was always 5 years ahead in age, but also in career and getting a Harvard tenureship, etc., and then becoming national security advisor, and that Zbig was always 5 years behind him, and that's definitely true. And there was a lot of very deep tension as well as respect of Brzezinski towards Kissinger. But when Brzezinski died, there's a letter that Kissinger sent to Ian's mother, Muska, saying, I could not believe my reaction. I sat down and I cried because this was a world where I'd lost somebody to talk to. They could speak a language. And it was a really emotional letter that was read out, I think, at Brzezinski's funeral. With Vance, Vance was a old school WASP. He was a very decent Wall Street lawyer, had served LBJ. Like everybody else, including Brzezinski, including Kissinger, had supported Vietnam and then realized you shouldn't support Vietnam. Pretty much everybody was wrong on Vietnam until they were right, and then they forgot they'd been wrong. So it was, and it was one of Brzezinski's embarrassments that he'd not come out against Vietnam. He really, really was quite embarrassed about that, particularly after he came out early, and I think this motivated him to very early against the Iraq War. But Vance, I just don't think was any match for Brzezinski. The political skills, the bureaucratic skills, the proximity to the president, the relationship with Carter. Vance was not helped by that, but he was also not helped by Brezhnev. The way the Soviets behaved increasingly played into Brzezinski's hands of the kinds of policy Carter should be pursuing. And it is a very important relationship in the book, and I think there's a sort of element of tragedy there, because Iran is everybody's nemesis, the Iran hostage crisis, including Vance, including Carter.
I will say, when I was at CSIS back in the 2000s, John Hammery and I, a few others, we decided to do a big honoring and create a a memorial for Brzezinski. He was still alive, and we recruited a variety of folks, but it was right after the invasion of Iraq. And so a lot of Republicans were mad, and still a lot of Democrats were alienated. And so fascinating how difficult it was. We had a wonderful turnout, but complex feelings all around. Did that affect him at all? Did he care how, that at the same time that he had some strong supporters, that he had pretty much a pretty substantial legion of folks that had questions?
Yeah, I mean, he was really hated by the left, and Ian can correct me if I'm wrong. I think I'm right. Ian, watched Brzezinski at the 1980 convention being called by Bob Strauss onto the stage, the cabinet called him, and he just gets booed by the Kennedy wing. He's Darth Vader to the left. And he becomes a hero to the left after 9/11, I guess, and being quite a lonely and brave voice, but along with Brent Scowcroft. I don't think he particularly liked belonging to groups or following tribes or digesting groupthink and synthesizing consensuses. He was a very independent thinker. And ultimately, I think that's the post-public career difference with Kissinger. Kissinger had Kissinger Associates. And for Kissinger Associates to keep minting money, he needed to provide his clients with introductions to people in power, in not just in America, but in China, in the Kremlin too. And so he never burnt his bridges with them. He kept his access. Brzezinski didn't have Brzezinski Associates. I mean, he made money from books and speeches and some consultancies, but he basically, would burn his access to people quite regularly. He was very intellectually honest, and he didn't belong to a tribe. Even Democrats, he sort of turned against sometimes. He voted for Nixon. He endorsed George Bush Sr., really didn't like George Bush Jr., but he endorsed George Bush Sr. He wasn't a realist, he wasn't an idealist, he wasn't a hawk, he wasn't a dove, he was his own person, which is what makes him fascinating.
Great. Let's open it up for some questions. I mean, why don't you just hand the microphone to folks so I can I think I probably can handle it. And then if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself, and then a relatively short question, and then maybe if you're going to make a statement, just say, "Aren't I right?" or something like that at the end. So,
sure.
Robert, we'll go to you.
Adam DePico from Columbia University. I just have a question on the Vance dynamics. Looking at the role of analogical reasoning in the foreign policy decision-making, at Columbia we studied with Secretary Clinton the famous failure with Operation Eagle Claw in Tehran, and how there were 2 points of references, the USS Pueblo for Vance and obviously the Entebbe raid for Brzezinski. Do you have any other examples where personal circumstances deeply framed his foreign policy decision-making, and was it with great success or failure? Thank you.
Well, I mean, Iran was his and Carter's, the whole administration's biggest failure. The Entebbe raid happened when he was in Israel in 76, I think. So it was before the Carter administration. 76. And he was having dinner with Shimon Peres, the defense minister, and he kept saying to Peres, "Why don't you just send the commandos in to the airport?" Peres looked really awkward and kept going out of the dinner, and then coming back in, and then overnight, the next day, they realized that's what Peres had been planning, and so that stuck in his head. And Brzezinski was not a military. I don't think he understood these things very well, because Tehran was a very different environment to an airport in Africa. The Eagle Claw operation was 4 stages: Desert 1, Desert 2, overnight in the desert after getting people out of a vast teeming metropolis, putting them in this disused sports stadium, then taking them in the mountains, having another night in the desert before hiding out in the day during the desert before taking a night exit out of the country. 48 hours. This was a harebrained scheme. It wasn't Brzezinski's scheme. It was the Pentagon's scheme. But because they wanted secrecy, they never did a full dress rehearsal. So for some of the people at that notorious, infamous, disastrous Desert One, where it began and ended, were meeting each other for the first time. So the whole thing was a complete sort of very, very ill-conceived operation. And, Brzezinski bears his responsibility for that, for sure.
And as you, I'm sure know, it was largely because of Desert One that led to the Goldwater-Nichols reforms, unified military commands, and better planning. Robert, over to you, please.
Robert Hunter, I work for Zbig. Congratulations on the person who is now beginning to give Zbig his due. Thank you. Don't forget he had a great sense of humor. Nobody's mentioned that yet. Let me ask you one question, Ed. You knew a lot about Zbig before you wrote this. You now know as much about him except for his children, I guess. What about Zbig surprised you as you did the book?
That's a wonderful question, and thank you so much for all the help you gave, and you even read a chapter for me and sent back corrections, which were all correct, so thank you. What surprised me the most? So I'd known him for 11 years. I don't think, not like a deep friendship or anything, but I'd had lunch with him 20 or 30 times. I'd interviewed him many, many times. So I was aware of sort of the type of person he was. What surprised me really was, and what I found most difficult to research, was the early Polish years. And it's, I had his mother's diaries, which were a godsend, had them translated. They're very long, and they're very they're overwrought in places, but they're also quite lyrical. Then his diaries begin, but the sort of understanding of the formative years is really important. And it's how he went from being that sort of wounded Polish nationalist, Polish citizen wishing to correct history, to being somebody who was also very American. And he went back to Poland for the first time in 1957 as a scholar. So he'd left in 38, 57. And when he went back and he saw what he described in his diaries as the lifeless eyes of people who are really accepting grudgingly the sort of dead weight of the system then, that's when he felt American, is when he went back to Poland. And that odyssey was the most interesting to me. I didn't, thank goodness, come across like a philandering Brzezinski, because if I had, I would have written it. A biography is warts and all, life in full. And I did, as I say, go through the proverbial underwear drawers. I had all these private sort of things. So I'm very glad I didn't discover that, because I would have written it. But I wasn't expecting to find a philanderer. This isn't, he was very different to Dick Holbrook. I think that's a really, really good biography, by the way, but it's a different kind of character.
Can you just, maybe Robert, you too, you witnessed this, but just one or two words about a relationship that I don't think gets as much attention, the relationship between Zbig and Carter. It was such a dynamic, deep relationship, and I think filled with a lot of trust. They understood each other's weaknesses, but still trust to the last days.
Me or Robert?
Both.
Robert.
Carter and Brzezinski competed with one another. Carter tolerated it much more than he would from somebody else because Zbig would stand up to him. And maybe the most important thing is when they played tennis with one another, they played for keeps.
Just a very quick thing. The notes that Carter would send, like, Zbig, do you never know when to stop? Could you learn to give up? And then little notes, was one that I found quite amusing. Like, Mr. President, I deeply resent your implication that I'm not fulfilling your policy properly. And then there's an apology from Carter, who then sort of gently goes back to what he wants to do. It's not like Carter was putty in Brzezinski's hands. They had arguments and disagreed with each other, and it's not the Rubio-Trump relationship in that respect.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, what were we're going to take 2 questions this time.
Mike Brzezinski, you mentioned Justin Vase, and I thought his book was fascinating. And now you've done yours, which I haven't had a chance to read because it just arrived in the mail today. But it's curious that the 2 major books about Brzezinski have both been done by Europeans. That's presuming that the English still consider themselves European. But is it because he wasn't part of the celebrity culture of America, or that he wasn't part of the group activity that's so common in America? And how come no American biographer, journalist, whatever, has wanted to tackle this as him as a biographical subject?
I'm going to hold on that. We're going to take one other. Is there a little bit? Yes, let's the nice woman in red, please.
Hi, thank you so much to the Aspen Strategy Group for hosting this. Savannah Lane. I work with Jonathan Price, and someone I know you know well. A quick question. I know you had mentioned briefly, and I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but given the recent developments with the first American Pope, would love to hear a little bit more color on such a unique relationship between him and the Pope, as well as some of your thoughts on using the moral authority and influence of the Holy See and the new American Pope. Thank you.
I'll start with you because it's freshest in my mind, but Mike, I know what you asked. The relationship with the Pope was a unique one. I don't think there's ever, he had P for Pope on his White House phone. So he had a Vatican hotline because they did talk a lot and they corresponded. And, I don't want to exaggerate that relationship in stopping the Soviet invasion of Poland. I think they probably understood it was a porcupine all by themselves, but they were going to invade. The Pope, when he first officially as Pope came to the United States, on the first night in Washington, invited the Brzezinskis to dinner at the Vatican Embassy up on Massachusetts. And so they all went. And Brzezinski said, I'm going to bring my family. And I think he had to get Ian off a track or soccer field, and they had to change him quickly. But they had all 3 of the kids and Muska there. And that was when they first cracked this joke, because the Pope had just had some time with Carter. And they first cracked this joke that they kept repeating to each other over the years, that Carter was like a religious leader and the Pope was like a president, because the Pope was so good at geopolitics. And so, it's not the spiritual side of that relationship that matters in terms of this biography, although Brzezinski was very solicitous of it. Mike, I don't know. I mean, I think, the diaries are a massive primary source, as are many others, including the papal correspondence. And I don't think they were available. So I don't think it's that Americans aren't interested in doing a biography. There is plenty of room for more biographies. And I think they will now be made available. I don't know. Ian will know better. But there is a lot of scope for more biographies, and there's a lot of stuff still being declassified, and there's there's a lot more to write. Having said that, this book is obviously definitive and the last word on the subject. I mean, I should underline that point.
I'm going to ask one question, then I want to then open it up. You mentioned in the book that there were times that Reagan and people around him actually thought about bringing him in as national security advisor. In your view, did Brzezinski aspire to serve again at senior levels in his career? I know he had a relationship with Obama. That was a complicated one. How did he see that future, play out, in which he mostly wrote, did a little bit of travel, spent a little bit of time with a few students? Did he think that the call would come again?
I think by Obama he didn't. That was an endorsement based on Obama's opposition to the Iraq War. It was a very timely endorsement so Ben Rhodes, was very helpful to this book. He really emphasized just how big a deal it was for Obama, because it was during the 3 a.m. Ads that Hillary was posting. Obama's inexperienced, can you trust him at 3 a.m.? And to have this figure, Brzezinski, come and endorse Obama at that moment was very helpful. But he endorsed Bush Sr. He did not like Dukakis. He thought Dukakis had never visited, and he kept citing this, France, Germany, or Britain. He'd been to Greece a couple of times. But he basically was an ingenue when it came to the world. And he felt too much of a pacifist, not pacifist, but too passive in his idea of, the Cold War and how to manage it. And I do think he he expected to be offered more than ambassador to Japan by Bush Senior, which is what he was offered, and so he declined it. But that's the only instance I know where he realistically wanted a job. He certainly didn't try and get one. Robert might correct me, from the Clinton administration, nor did he expect one from. And you were ambassador to NATO at that time. No, I don't think he expected one.
Okay, we're going to take two last questions. Then remember, folks, we are at a book party, so you buy a book. You say thank you, you buy a book, he signs it, and then you leave and you go read it. Okay, so over there in the back, please, and then right here.
Hi, my name is Phil, and I have a question about things that we kind of overlook. Canada, I would love to learn what you learned about him and his experience. If there's a bildungsroman piece to the book, the years spent in Canada, how did that shape him and his attitude towards Canada? Were they just too pacifists, and so he didn't really think about them during the Cold War? What was his relationship to Canada like? Thanks.
Great question. We'll take one more question, and then we'll open it up. Here, I'm going to go to this gentleman right here, please. Okay, I'll take you two. We're gonna do two more, so then you're gonna have to just keep these fresh in your memory, and then we'll.
Thank you. James Paisley. I currently work with the federal government. One of the things you pointed out early was Zbig's, his influence on the peaceful outcomes for the Cold War. And thinking with regards to the world that we are currently moving into, I wonder what you think the world will most miss from him in the moments that we have coming down towards us. Thank you.
Right here.
Thank you. Rafa Libera. I had actually a very similar question in the context of the framework that he used to use in relation to Soviet Union. In the current climate, what do you think would be most useful to utilize from his toolkit?
Okay, so Canada and the sort of geopolitical framing. The Canada thing is a very important part of the book. I think there's a little bit of a myth amongst some in Canada, or was at the time, that he didn't like Canada, couldn't wait to leave it. I don't think that's fair or true, but he didn't see Canada as a large enough vehicle for his ambitions. I mean, if you wanted to roll back the Soviets, there was only one place to go. And so his journey is really relentless journey down the East Coast, Montreal, Harvard, New York, Washington. And that's, it's essentially a train journey, right? But it's also the career progress. He was at McGill, and it was at McGill that he did his famous undergraduate thesis, where he laid out the whole Achilles heel, weakness of the Soviet system, and saw Tito as a key to unraveling it. That was in 1950 that he wrote that, and it is just stunningly prescient, and it's extraordinary. And at that point, all this new sort of department of Soviet area studies, they saw the Soviet Union as a monolith. And 10 years later, he introduces this subject, comparative communism, at Columbia. But anyway, some of his family stayed in Columbia. Ian's uncle, his surviving younger sibling, Lech, still in Quebec, and was very helpful to this book. He didn't hate Canada. It just wasn't a good enough launch pad for his. And in terms of, there's been so many, debates about whether Trump is up to a reverse Kissinger. I think it's probably fairer to call it a reverse Nixon Kissinger. Then, of course, China normalization happens. Carter, Brzezinski. There's no evidence that this is something that Trump is actually really strategically planning to do. But after the Cold War, Brzezinski wrote this book called Out of Control, and at the time it was very fashionable to be triumphalist, and there was a lot of self-respect that the West gave to itself, and Washington in particular, for winning the Cold War. And it went from, I think, a situation where the imperative was to study the adversary, which I think was what the Cold War University did. It produced many, many people, including Brzezinski and Kissinger, who were very, very knowledgeable about the world with which America was dealing, to the reverse of that, which is, well, we won the Cold War, and we're the apogee, and others should now study us. And so America became less strategic, in my view. And I think Brzezinski then, in this book, Out of Control, which was jarring with that sort of triumphalist spirit at the time, warned that there would be an alliance of the aggrieved. This is 1993, and the alliance of the aggrieved would be Russia, China, this time with China as big brother, Russia's little brother, Iran, North Korea, and others. And you saw them basically on the Red Square with Putin last Friday. He wrote that in 93. So, I mean, he got quite a few things wrong, Brzezinski, but the subtitle has the word profit in it, and I thought carefully about that word. His predictive record was extraordinary.
Guys, please join it. Let's congratulate Ed on a remarkable book. Congratulations. All right. So books back there. I want to see a line of folks moving in this direction, and we look forward to more appearances on Morning Joe. Thanks.